for those of you who don't know, a couple of interesting things about my background, a couple of interesting people in my head. Um, and one of the interesting things about my background is that I was assigned female at birth and spent the first 14 years of my life very much presenting girl, having that as my identity piece where I was sitting. And then briefly, for like 6 months, came out as trans and then went back in and then came out again and transitioned fully 4 or 5 years ago. But in the interim time, I kind of circled back around to certain extremes of gender. So some of the time I had I am very much a woman. That's definitionally important to my identity. Everything about the way that I interact with the world is shaped through that lens. And some of the time I had, and have in many ways at this point, a stance of I am a guy, and that means various different things. For some of the people in the brain, that's a very comfortable stance of their identity was formed from a place of masculinity. So, for all intents and purposes, they're cis guys. For some of us, we're very much trans men. And that has interesting bearing on how we interact with the world and how the world interacts with us. So that's kind of the structural framework where I'm coming from with giving this talk. So as you all know, we live in a society, and there are pros and cons to this society. Because as with any structure of community, there are a lot of rules. And if one is perceived as being transgressive in the face of those rules, you can get a lot of social pushback because, well, doing things the way that they're agreed to be done is the underpinning of what society runs on, right? So if you do something that's counter to those expectations, clearly you are undermining the way that society is supposed to work. I mean, how unreasonable to expect people to follow different scripts talking to you than they would otherwise. They know how to talk to a woman. You're a woman. Why are you trying not to be? Then they don't know how to talk to you. So we have a lot of, in some ways, reasonable internal conflict possible between what we expect to see, right? We get cognitive dissonance. If I think someone is a woman and I start using the scripts for a woman, and then suddenly those scripts are wrong, that can be really weird. Not me, actually, me, one. But it's something it's important to be aware of when thinking about frameworks of gender and interaction with the world. Because understanding where something's coming from goes a long way towards figuring out how to engage with it and how to shape where things are going to. So we have, as a society, very strong expectations and scripts and rulings for how gender should be done and for what different gender roles mean. We have, generally speaking, a perspective on women as focused on care roles and men as focused on, depending on which part of the country you're in, money or militant interaction with the world, having the more traditionally outside the home pieces associated. And as time goes on, that becomes less black and white. We live less within this binary, but there's still a lot of binary expectations. And there are pros and cons to falling in different places within that binary. I think a lot of the time, even when we look critically at gender and gender roles in our society, we talk about them from a framework of this is limiting us, which is true, and it's unfair to X category, which is also true. But who it's limiting and what category it's unfair to is actually a more complex question than we usually see it as being because of questions of power and privilege. If you have access to more resources because you fall into a given category, you have privilege from being in that category. If you have reduced access to resources, you have less privilege in that direction. And I specify that because we all know women are paid less. Pink tax is not good, words I will filter out for the purpose of putting this on the internet. So there are definitely just things that are not good about being seen as a woman in our society. There are also things that can be rough about being perceived as a man in our society and ways that that limits interaction opportunities. Growing up as a rapidly physically developing young lady, I started being interacted with as a potential sex object when I was about 12 years old, which is when I started looking like I was about 18 years old. And over the course of the next several years, I got used to existing in a world where the first thing that was perceived was breasts. And then there was a person there too. And I got a lot of weird cat calls in my time. You know, you expect the normal script, but it's a little jarring to be 16 walking along and have someone look at you and go, damn, them some big titties. It's like, okay, sir, you might not be wrong, but did you have to say it? And that's not great, right? It's not fun to walk around in a world where people feel entitled to commenting on your body and where people feel entitled to observing your body through their preferred lens. And there were definitely benefits to being perceived as straight up, just no holds barred, that's a woman. It was easy to help people feel safe. People very rarely reflexively saw me as a threat because I was walking around wearing pretty dresses and having this physical form that coded to our society as soft, open, caretaker, available, social. And I played into that, partially because of social norms being an oof. If my options were be perceived based on my body and be perceived negatively, or play into the feminine scripts and be perceived for my body, but at least it's a positive perception, not a fun set of choices, but I figured I would rather be perceived positively. But it meant that I had access to creating safe spaces that I very much valued. When I came out as trans, I stopped having to be as hyper aware of my appearance all the time, which is weird because in some ways I would have expected myself to be more aware of it. Well, what if people are looking at me and seeing? Well, what if people are looking at me and thinking, am I successfully passing? But instead, it was this breath of fresh air. Oh, people are interacting with me for reasons other than breasts. Mind you, I spent a lot of time interacting with a lot of people. Very rarely beyond the first couple of sentences at most were they interacting with my chest and then me. But it was foundational enough to my experience of introductory interactions that that was what felt like the truth of all ongoing communication, that it was built on this premise of I'm defined by my visual perceptible characteristics. And then also you talk to me. And when I got my top surgery, it was something of a weight off my chest, if you will, uh, where suddenly I didn't have to go through that filter. If someone talked to me on the street, if someone flagged me down, suddenly it probably wasn't going to be to demand a birthday hug. It wasn't going to be to comment on the neckline of my shirt. I didn't know what it was going to be, which was its own kind of stressful, but I knew it wasn't that because that wasn't there to be seen anymore. And then I discovered that that was awesome. It was great. I loved that. I loved having the same outfit get a drastically different social response. I had a comfy sweatshirt that I liked to wear. It wasn't one of the big, 3 sizes too big, but it was a comfy sweatshirt. And I remember at one point wearing it to high school and having someone comment on what a slut I was because I was wearing something that showed off my body so much. And I wore the same sweatshirt after my top surgery. And no one batted an eye because it was just a guy wearing a sweatshirt. That wasn't even on people's radar. But I also discovered that people reacted less openly to me by default. People tended to have a little bit more reluctance. The same gossip in the bathroom, oh my God, I love your shoes, got a different set of responses. If I walked up to someone to give them a compliment, they tensed slightly and then relaxed. And I have always been very queer coded, regardless of which direction or what I was presenting. But I definitely doubled down on the gay best friend energy because the way to be non-threatening by default as a man in our society is to behave in feminine ways. And what that looks like is queer. It took it from, hey, I wanted to say I love your shoes, to, oh my God, I love your shoes. Those are so cute. Same communication, but had to play up the, here I am commenting on this in a way that is playful and friendly. No, I'm not just giving this feedback on you as an appearance as a person. As a side note on that, something that Mickey taught me when I was growing up was the importance of complimenting people on things they have agency over. If you see someone and you comment on the color of their skin or the shape of their body or the texture of their hair or their height, anything that they can't control, you're saying, I see the things that you just have to deal with being more than I see you. If you compliment someone on the choices they've made, the outfit they're wearing, the color of their nails, the style of their hair. Oh, I love that hair dye. It makes it about who the person is through the lens of what they are choosing to present. But I had to go really hard to the soft. Funny statement there, but I had to specifically emphasize softening everything. And I grew up with an understanding of softeners because I'm going to talk about Mickey for a minute here. Before she came out, she was still very femme-coded a lot of the time, and very specifically talked to me repeatedly throughout my childhood about social perception and being socially read as a man in a 6'8" body. being in a physical form that was already large and with our society's expectations from the behavior of men coded as threatening. So I grew up being explicitly taught, here's how you soften your voice. Here's how you hold yourself physically so that you're not looming over someone, which is funny since I'm 5'4". But I still had to learn how to not use the force of personality in a way that would lead people to reading as threatening, which turned out to be really valuable after I came out because suddenly people would. People also took me more seriously in some contexts. If I'm making a responsible adulting phone call and I open with, hey, I'm just calling to check in about, I get a very, very different response than if I say, hi, I'm calling to talk to you about. And which I want to go with varies, partially depending on context, partially depending on the way that the person I'm talking to reacts. But I had to consciously decide whether I would prefer to be properly gendered over the phone or to be gentle to people. Because if I speak in short, gruff sentences without softeners at the lower end of my register, I get treated more respectfully. I get more direct answers. I get less condescension. I have an easier time navigating through getting to who I need to talk to. But people also aren't warm in response. They aren't cheerful. They aren't open. They're just getting me through the process and trying not to draw aggro. If I engage with them in a positive, open way, I get positive, open reactions and she, her a lot. I had the hilarious interaction with the Samsung helpline recently, where they asked to clarify at one point, making sure they're speaking to the right person. And they said, I'm speaking with Miss Ash Phoenix, yes? And I said, yes, this is Mr. Ash Phoenix, which was the first time I'd done that particular flavor of advocacy. I was very happy about that. And they had the most charming response. They said, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Phoenix. And then literally every 2 sentences for the remainder of the call referred to me as Sir Phoenix. Oh, yes, Sir Phoenix, I'm just going to put you on hold for a minute. Thank you so much. So I was talking to our assistive line, and so I've got someone over here for you to talk to now, Sir Phoenix. And it was just delightful. But I am solidly sure that if I had opened that conversation in a tone that would have avoided getting miss, I wouldn't have gotten that positive a reaction, even if I had corrected about my pronouns. Because part of what got that very warm, I'm going to be actively positive, was the fact that when I started talking to them, it was, hi, I wanted to talk to you about the state of my washing machine repair. And there have been times where I needed to talk to someone and be taken seriously, and they wouldn't until I dropped my voice. I have had phone calls where I got called Miss every sentence while being dismissed. And as soon as I dropped my voice to hear and clarified that, no, really, I would like to speak with someone who can help me with my problem, they immediately switched to getting me the help that I needed and taking care of the task. And yes, we're so sorry. And universally, that was when talking with men. If I talk to, and I say that with a slight assumption based on tonality and vocal register. But if I'm talking to someone who's flagging woman on the phone, and I am distant or abrupt, I tend to get a very, I am being polite and I am trying to solve your problems for you, so please don't get upset with me tone. If I'm talking to a man and I sound abrupt and gruff, I get talked to. If I'm talking to a man and I sound soft and open, it's about a 50-50 chance. Sometimes I get really warm, open responses, usually from people who have queer-coded toning in their voice. And sometimes I get really not taken very seriously. If I'm soft and open with someone who's coding as a woman on the phone, I pretty universally get a soft, open response. Usually with at least one comment on, thank you so much for all of your patience, or I really appreciate your attitude here, because people like being treated nicely. And unfortunately, one of the things our society says is the purview of women is being nice. And that really sucks. And in a lot of ways, I see that as a place where men get the short end of the stick. Because as much as there is the really problematic hashtag not all men trope, it is true both that statistically, men are more likely to be a threat in our society, and that most men aren't actually a threat. Most people aren't actually a threat. But the impact of the behavior of enough people to be unsafe, it's kind of that 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio. Takes 5 really decent people to balance out one pretty shitty person. And that means that one of the privileges that comes with being read as a woman is the privilege of not being read immediately as a potential threat. You don't get paid as much, but you get not paid as much more cheerfully. And it's really funky when you're very much either when you're non-binary or when your presentation is in a very non-binary way, and people don't really know what to do with you. I've gotten occasionally on official phone calls with the same person back to back in like, a sentence that has a gender, sentence that doesn't, and a sentence that does. Mr. sentence Miss. Or Phoenix. And I always feel so bad for them. I'm always like, I'm so sorry. I really am not fitting within the social scripts you have primed here, which is really rough if you're running explicitly off social scripts for something like service calls. But it's also interesting when you are socially read as a certain gender and as trans. Because for the most part at this point, I pass. Most people who see and interact with me in general are like, that's a guy. That's fine. That's just a thing. But when around people, specifically who are also trans, I tend to be read as trans man. And in a lot of parts of the country, that would be terrifying. In a lot of the parts of the country, having someone look at me and say, you are trans, by which I mean socially transgressive, would be actively unsafe. Fortunately, living in the Pacific Northwest, it's pretty safe for me to be clocked as trans. And because I'm very open about the fact that I'm trans, I don't find it offensive for someone to go, you were assigned female at birth. I'm like, yes, I was, and look how far I've come. Or depending on who's responding, yes, I was. Isn't that nice for me? But the ways that people interact with a man and a trans man vary. Not for everyone. For some people, they're like, man is man is man, that's fine. Whether that means they find me threatening or whether that means that they just find me a man because they don't find men threatening. But there are a lot of people I know personally and have bumped into kind of thing who would find a man threatening, but don't find me threatening despite seeing me as a man because, well, I'm a trans man. And part of that is because as a trans man, I'm also a member of a minority and thus more vulnerable, which usually aligns with being less of a threat in most people's eyes, certainly. But also, there's a general sense of, well, you've been where I am. Yes, you're a man, but you've also been objectified. Yes, you're a man, but you've also had to walk through the world with an expectation of potential threat. Yes, you're a man, but you get it. And that can be helpful, that can be nice. But the single biggest piece of privilege I find in getting clocked as trans while living in a state where that's safe is other people feeling more safe with me because I'm trans. I've had a lot of people come out as trans while interacting with me. I think I've dated 5, maybe 6 people who were cis-identified when we started dating and had come out as somewhere between non-binary and transitioning fully to the other side of the binary by the time we stopped dating. I used to joke that I might try to date cis people, but I'm always wrong. But people tend to see, oh, you're trans, so that means you're someone it's safe for me to have a socially transgressive gender identity with. And that's really valuable to me. And I know personally trans people who would much prefer to just not have people see that they're trans, who would go, nope, that's my personal business, that's my personal thing. I don't want people to look at me and go, you haven't always been the way that you are now. But I also know myself and several other people that I know, both in my family and not, who see the opportunity to provide safe spaces for other people just by being themselves unabashedly as a point of privilege. Just by existing in the world as me, I can create a space where more people are comfortable existing in the world as themselves. So, living in this part of the country, I feel very privileged to have people read me as trans, especially when they read me as trans and acknowledge and respect my identity. That's that sweet spot. Give me that good gender affirmation. But in the wide range of contexts in our society, locations and jobs and relationships, and in all of the various flavors of gender identity, binary and non, there are pros and cons and doors that are opened and doors that are closed and doors that are just harder to get to. And I think we often look at gender and privilege as much more black and white, as much more within a binary of its own than they actually are. And coming from my perspective of cis woman all the way up through internal identities that are cis men, I've seen enough sides of this complex picture to appreciate the complexity. And I hope other people see themselves and their options with the compassion that comes from acknowledged complexity as well. Thank you.